Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Megan Bryan again, and this is lecture number 3 in my History of the Vampire and Folklore Literature and Film series. As mentioned, the past 2 lectures, the vampire has been many things, from the blood-sucking peasant of folklore to the aristocratic Byron-like libertine to the less intimidating and more emotional creatures of the mid-19th century. At the end of the 19th century, in Dracula, Bram Stoker returns the vampire to its roots of an unfeeling monster, and Stoker, more than any other before or since, seems to have understood what made the vampire a truly enduring threat and ensured its popularity for many centuries to come. The monstrous characterization of Dracula by Stoker may have been due to the source of his name. There is evidence Stoker had done some research on Vlad Dracula, the ruler of Wallachia in present-day Romania, from 1456 to 62, otherwise known as Vlad the Impaler. In a time when brutality and cruelty was the order of the day, Vlad Dracula was rumored to outdo them all. Of course, all these rumors need to be taken with a pinch of salt, as Vlad made many enemies, and much of what was written about him could well be baseless propaganda. However, there are a few confirmed stories. You can see here, this is the portrait of Vlad that was supposedly copied from one in his lifetime, so we think that's what he looks like. And this is a German woodcut from 1499, so after his death, but still around that time. And it says here, it's a German pamphlet. At that time, Dracula rested there and had the entire suburb burned. Also, as the day came early in the morning, all those whom he had taken captive, men and women, young and old children, he had impaled on the hill by the chapel and all around the hill, and under them he proceeded to eat at table and get his joy this way. And the eating at the table might not be accurate, but the impalement of the town is a recorded fact. The town of Arid, 20,000 people were impaled by Vlad. Now, one of the confirmed stories about Vlad includes the story of the Turkish ambassadors who were sent to treat with Vlad, who, as was Turkish custom, kept their hats on in his presence. Dracula inquired why they did this, and they replied that it was not their custom to remove their hats. Dracula replied that he wanted to strengthen their customs, and so nailed the hats to their heads in an almost Joker-like fashion there. This story is confirmed by German, Russian, and Romanian sources. And you can see here, these are Romanian oral accounts from 1972 about Vlad. This prince is very severe, but also just. He would not tolerate thieves, liars, and lazy people. He did all in his power to extirpate such men from his land. Had he reigned longer, he would probably have succeeded in freeing his land from such parasites, and perhaps even prevented that others of that kind be born, but no such luck today. It's kind of harsh, but they think it's fair. The gospel says that man shall earn his daily bread only through the sweat of his brow. Prince Vlad thought these men, beggars, live off the sweat of others, so they are useless to humanity as a form of thievery. They are worse than robbers. May such men be eradicated from my land. And to eradicate them, he calls all the beggars and people who can't work into a church on Easter, and then locks the doors and sets it on fire. And that is also a confirmed source. From multiple places, Romania and Germany. And here, Dracula was a man with gray matter in his brains, and he insisted on good order in his state. Woe to any soldier he saw improperly attired. He rarely escaped with his life. He liked to see his citizens cleanly attired and looking smart. Around him, he could not tolerate anyone who floundered or was slow in his work. Whenever he noticed a libertine or a rake, he lost his temper. It is just as well that Dracula does not rule our country today, for he would have to expend many stakes, which might have eliminated from our land the innumerable drones who wither the very grass on which they sit. So again, it's a bit harsh, but that's the attitude. And it's interesting, of course, that he doesn't like libertines or rakes, considering that's how he's most often portrayed now, as this kind of womanizing monster, a bit like Lord Ruthven. Another story supported by the multiple sources is that of a merchant who traveled through Wallachia and had his money stolen. He told Dracula of this, who gave him what he had lost plus 1 extra ducat. The merchant counted his money several times and went back to Dracula, telling him that he'd given him an extra ducat. And Dracula let the man keep it, saying he would have impaled him if he had not given it back, as then he would have been a thief. Really doesn't like thieves, Vlad. And so yeah, that was his reputation, was this kind of harsh but fair. We would think very harsh, but as late as 1972 in Romania, they still thought very fair. While these acts seem cruel and monstrous to us today, and would have also in the 19th century, Vlad Tepes is still seen as a noble figure in Romania, a national hero of the country. And his association with the vampire Dracula is fairly offensive to them, although they are happy to exploit this connection for tourism reasons, as you'll find out if you ever visit Romania. As with all historical figures, truth can be difficult to separate from fiction, and opinions can fluctuate wildly depending on the context, you can see here. The novel Dracula is truly a complex work. Jonathan Harker, who is the narrator of the first third of the story, writes in his diary and was known as shorthand, and he describes this as 19th century up to date with a vengeance. And yet, unless my senses deceive me, the old centuries had and have powers of their own which mere modernity cannot kill. And the statement is a succinct summary of the novel itself. Count Dracula is a product of the old centuries, and only primitive rituals can kill him, while modern medical advances, such as blood transfusions, provide him with more sustenance. Jeffrey Wall, who was my PhD supervisor, wrote on Dracula and describes the novel as being fascinated by the evident contradiction between the archaic stuff of its narrative and the contemporary techniques which allow that narrative to emerge. So the novel, as well as the characters in it, are caught between the ancient and the modern. Dracula is a creature of early superstition walking contemporary London streets. The novel contains the latest in late Victorian consumer goods, cameras, photographs, and portable typewriters. But at the same time, the past in Dracula extends across space into those zones of arrested development which modernity has not fully reached, where the trains do not yet run on schedule or where the railway lines have come to an abrupt halt. And you can see this right from the beginning of the novel. It's a literal journey to the past. Jonathan Harker, on his journey into Transylvania at the beginning, notes the delays in the railway as a symptom of traveling back to a more primitive past. That's the quote here underneath the picture of me. The impression I had was that we were leaving the West and entering the East. The most Western of splendid bridges over the Danube, which is here of noble width and depth, took us among the traditions of Turkish rule. It seems to me that the further east you go, the more unpunctual are the trains. What ought they to be in China? So that's some lovely imperialist writing there. But you can see here very starkly illustrated this barrier between West and East, between the civilized Danube in Budapest and then the places of Turkish rule. So as we talked before about Byron and the Giaour, you have this Turkey, this eastern border as being this thing where threats live. And you can see that very clearly in Dracula, that once he goes into the area that seems Turkish, that's where he meets Dracula. When he says he's leaving the West, entering the East, it reveals a desire to keep those two regions separate in his mind, which establishes the dichotomy of us versus them. And at the beginning, he mentions some of the things we talked about before about this mixing of ethnicities and identities and nationalities. It says here, the district Count Dracula named is in the extreme east of the country, just on the borders of 3 states, Transylvania, Moldavia, and Bukovina. In the population of Transylvania, there are 4 distinct nationalities: Saxons in the south, and mixed with them the Wallachs, who are the descendants of the Dacians, Magyars in the west, and Selkels, I cannot pronounce this word, Sekelis, I think it is, in the east and north. I am going among the latter, who claim to be descended from Attila and the Huns. I read that every known superstition in the world is gathered into the horseshoe of the Carpathians, as if it were the center of some sort of imaginative whirlpool. If so, my stay may be very interesting. Memorandum, I must ask the Count all about them. And that's a very prophetic line, because he will find out all the superstitions through his stay in Transylvania. He doesn't need to ask the Count about them. The Count will reveal them to him. And he stays at a hotel called the Golden Krone in a city called Bistrita, which is a real city. And they have a little sign there. You can see this picture of me from 2004 when I visited there on May the 3rd, 1893, here at the Golden Crown in Bistrita, overnighted Bram Stoker's character Jonathan Harker on his way to Castle Dracula in the Borgo Pass. They have a little thing there. You can get the menu that he had. So again, they love the tourist aspect of Dracula in Romania. And when he leaves the Golden Krone, the lady who runs it says to him, "It is the eve of St. George's Day. Do you not know that tonight, when the clock strikes midnight, all the evil things in the world will have full sway? Do you know where you are going and what you are going to?" She was in such evident distress that I tried to comfort her, but without effect. However, there was business to be done, and I could allow nothing to interfere with it. I therefore said, as gravely as I could, that I thanked her, but my duty was imperative and that I must go. She then rose, and taking a crucifix from her neck, offered it to me. I did not know what to do, for as an English churchman, I had been taught to regard such things as in some measure idolatrous. and it seems so ungracious to refuse an old lady meaning so well and in such a state of mind. So he does take the crucifix, even though he's not a Catholic, and he's very glad that he did, because it stops Dracula from attacking him at one point in the novel. But you can see here you have this sort of what he would call a primitive superstition, the Catholic religion, the St. George's Day belief that the spirits hold sway, which he dismisses, but we'll find out that's very real. And he has this very late imperialist English sense of I have to do my duty no matter what, so nothing's going to keep me from it. And again, you have this conflict of religions here between the Catholic Church and the English Church, the Church of England is what it's called, which he represents. But he's lucky in a way that he got to meet the older Catholic religion, because that's what saves his life. And you can see here in the first quote that he notes the different ethnic groups that inhabit the area, a mix of 3 separate states. It is in this blurring of boundaries, cultures, and ethnicities where he will encounter Count Dracula. And as we discussed in the previous lectures, the vampires are a product of these cultures for precisely the instability and the uneasy divisions and blurrings of boundaries of the region it hails from. But Harker is sort of an arrogant guy, but he's also interested in gaining knowledge of the country. He asks the Count about Transylvanian history in particular, which he's going to talk about in a bit. And he makes a note to get the recipe of a local dish for his fiancée, Mina. And before he went to Transylvania, he goes to the British Library to learn all about it before he leaves London. So his interest in his non-native country is purely as a tourist, but the same cannot be said for Dracula. Now, Jonathan Harker is sent to Transylvania to arrange the sale of a house in England for Count Dracula, called Carfax Abbey, and that's where Dracula lives when he comes to England. Excuse me. And Harker tells him it's an abbey, it's an old ruin, and so Dracula says, "I myself am of an old family, and to live in a new house would kill me. The house cannot be made habitable in a day, and after all, how few days go to make up a century. I rejoice also that there is a chapel of old times. We Transylvanian nobles love not to think that our bones may lie amongst the common dead. I seek not gaiety nor mirth, not the bright voluptuousness of much sunshine and sparkling waters which please the young and gay. I am no longer young, and my heart, through weary years of mourning over the dead, is not attuned to mirth. Moreover, the walls of my castle are broken, the shadows are many, and the wind breathes cold through the broken battlements and casements. I love the shade and the shadow, and would be alone with my thoughts when I may." And Harker says somehow his words and his look did not seem to accord, or else it was that his cast of face made his smile look malignant and saturnine. So you can see her Dracula's basically just lying. He says, "I don't want to go among people. I like to be on my own." Wink. Which, of course, that's not really his plan. But this is what he tells Harker. And this is on the left is actually the real Castle Dracula. People are going to tell you that's a thing called Bran Castle. If you Google Castle Dracula, it's all that comes up. Bran Castle has nothing to do with Dracula, with Vlad. There is no connection to Dracula in Bran Castle except the fact that it's a castle in Romania. But this is Polnari Fortress, which Vlad the Impaler actually built in 1453 from a ruin. And this is another one of these strange but true stories that he invited all the nobles of the land, the boyars, to a feast, and then he locked the doors and enslaved them all and said, "You're going to have to build my castle." So this castle was built by the people that Dracula enslaved, many of whom died. So there's this belief that like their blood is mixed in the walls of the castle, which I think is pretty cool. So Dracula presents himself as a loner who shuns the company of others, but Harker can tell that he's lying about his intentions in England. And indeed, while Dracula never explicitly states his intentions in the novel, they can be drawn out through a close reading of the text. So you need to understand Dracula a bit as a character. And this is what he says when Harker asks him about his own background. And he says, "We Sikelis have a right to be proud, for in our veins flows the blood of many brave races who fought as the lion fights for lordship. Here in the whirlpool of European races, the Ugric tribe bore down from Iceland the fighting spirit, till the peoples thought that the werewolves themselves had come. Here too, when they came, they found the Huns, whose ward-like fury had swept the earth like a living flame, till the dying peoples held that in their veins ran the blood of those old witches who, expelled from Scythia, had mated with the devils in the desert. Fools, fools, what devil or what witch was ever so great as Attila, whose blood is in these veins?" He held up his arms. "Is it a wonder that we were a conquering race, that we were proud, that when the Turk poured his thousands on our frontiers, we drove them back. To us for centuries was trusted the guardian of the frontier of Turkeyland, aye, and more than that, endless duty of the frontier guard. Who was it but one of my own race who as voivode crossed the Danube and meet the Turk on his own ground? This was a Dracula indeed. Was it not this Dracula who inspired that other of his race, who in a later age again and again brought his forces over the great river into Turkeyland, who when he was beaten back came again and again and again, although he had to come alone from the bloody field where his troops were being slaughtered, since he knew that he alone could ultimately triumph. They said that he thought only of himself. Bah, what good are peasants without a leader? Wherein is the war without a brain and a heart to conduct it? Again, when we threw off the Hungarian yoke, we of the Dracula blood were amongst their leaders, for our spirit would not brook that we were not free. Ah, young sir, the Skelzics and the Draculas, their heart's blood, their brains and their swords, can boast a record that mushroom growths like the Habsburgs and the Romanovs can never reach. The warlike days are over. Blood is too precious a thing in these days of dishonorable peace, and the glories of the great races are as a tale that is told. So there's so much in here that you can unpack. You have this belief that we talked about, again, the whirlpool of the European races, the whirlpool of the different ethnicities and cultures, and he's confirming that there. And you have people thinking that they're werewolves, so you have this kind of association with the supernatural creature right here, or people descended from witches who mated with devils, so you have him kind of acknowledging this satanic background that he has. And he's speaking, I mean, you can see that Stoker's done his research about Vlad Dracula. This is what Vlad Dracula did. He guarded the frontier of Turkey, and beats the Ottomans back again and again and again. And that's what Vlad the Impaler famously did. Although you assume he's talking about himself in the novel because he's in fact immortal. And you have this idea of him being superior to others. What good are peasants without a leader? Which I guess is an attitude you'd get if you lived for like 500 years. And he's always talking about their heart's blood. So again, this obsession with blood, obviously he needs it to live, but it's also about like lineage and bloodlines and ancestry. And I think these last few lines are very sad, actually. I think this is where you get a glimpse of what he's actually thinking. The warlike days are over. Blood is too precious a thing in these days of dishonorable peace, and the glories of the great races are as a tale that is told. And I think that's where you really get the hint of what he's trying to do. He's trying to bring the warlike days back, the glories of the great race, his glory back. And you can see he's a persistent invader who does not take defeat lightly. And his strategy now in the present day is to create a demonic empire of the dead from the living British Empire, so he can bring back these glorious warlike days to him. But his methods for accomplishing this are more subtle and sinister than back in the distant past, where he just comes again and again and again and leaves his troops to die. This time his plan is to infiltrate the population of England by becoming just like them. And he does this by learning all he can about England. He has a collection of English books and insists on Harker correcting his English if he makes a mistake about them. And the scene here says that these companions, and he laid his hand on some of the books, have been good friends to me, and for some years past, ever since I had the idea of going to London, have given me many, many hours of pleasure. Through them, I have come to know your great England, and to know her is to love her. I long to go through the crowded streets of your mighty London, to be in the midst of the whirl and rush of humanity, to share its life, its change, its death, and all that makes it what it is. But alas, as yet I only know your tongue through books. To you, my friend, I look that I know it to speak. But Count, I said, you know and speak English thoroughly. He bowed gravely. I thank you, my friend, for your all too flattering estimate, but yet I fear that I am but a little way on the road I would travel. True, I know the grammar and the words, but yet I know not how to speak them. Indeed, I said, you speak excellently. Not so, he answered. Well, I know that, did I move and speak in your London, none there are who would not know me for a stranger. That is not enough for me. Here I am noble, I am boyar, the common people know me, and I am master. But a stranger in a strange land, he is no one. Men know him not, and to know not is to care not for. I am content if I am like the rest, so that no man stops if he see me, or pause in his speaking if he hear my words. Ha ha, stranger! I have been so long master that I would be master still, or at least that none other should be master of me. You shall, I trust, rest here with me a while, so that by our talking I may learn the English intonation, and I would that you tell me when I make error, even of the smallest, in my speaking. And you can see the way Dracula is written, and he says it here. He says, I know the words and the grammar, but I don't know how to speak it. And there's a difference, obviously, between someone who's just learned a language through books versus someone immersing themselves in the culture. And that's what Dracula is trying to do by talking to Harker. He says, if I make any mistake, I want you to correct me. I want to learn your accent. It says here to learn your English intonation. And interestingly, Dracula in the book is described, we think of him as this kind of, I am Dracula accent, but he's not described like that. Harker says he speaks with a strange intonation, as if he's sort of trying to get rid of his native accent. And he says here he's trying to adopt an English one. And so I think it'd be more accurate if he was portrayed with something attempting an English accent. But he has a lot of time, obviously, to perfect his accent, and that's what he's trying to do. And this here is one of Dracula's books, Bradshaw's Continental Railway Guide from 1891. He has all these lists about the nobility, about the railway timetables, what this is, so he can be like a native to know, so that people don't know he's a stranger. And you can see here that he talks about to go through the crowded streets, to be in the midst of the whirl and rush of humanity. Of course, he wants to drain them of blood. That's why he wants to do that. But he wants to blend in so completely that nobody knows he's any different from the rest of the English, and that's his plan for domination there. He's willing to sacrifice his national identity for power, to subsume the identity of an Englishman in order to conquer them. His mastery of his British victims begins with an intellectual appropriation of their culture, which allows him to delve into the workings of the native mind. He does this so successfully in the book that not only is he able to manipulate Jonathan Harker, but he is able to become him. And this is a scene in the book where Harker sees him going out the window dressed like him. He says, I'd been at the window somewhat less than half an hour when I saw something coming out of the Count's window. I drew back and watched carefully and saw the whole man emerge. It was a new shock to me to find that he had on the suit of clothes which I had worn whilst traveling here, and slung over his shoulder the terrible bag which I had seen the women take away. This is an earlier scene. Dracula has 3 women in his castle with him, who we don't really ever understand who they are. It never says like if they're related to him, if they're his mistresses. We assume the latter, obviously. But they try and attack Harker, and he stops them and says, this man belongs to me, and he throws a bag at them that he's got for them. And Harker says you can hear the strangled cry of the little child, and then the women take the bag and like eat the child. Basically, it's a really horrific idea, but the assumption is that the women stay in the castle and Dracula goes out to hunt by basically abducting children for the women to eat, to drink the blood of. So it's pretty nasty. And Harker says there could be no doubt as to his quest, and in my garb too. This then is his new scheme of evil, that he will allow others to see me as they think, so that he may both leave evidence that I have been seen in the towns or villages, posting my own letters, and that any wickedness which he may do shall by the local people be attributed to me. And this appears to work. People seem to believe that Dracula has just become Harker by wearing his clothes, because later on he comes back, and Harker says, I heard a sound in the courtyard without, the agonized cry of a woman. I rushed to the window and, throwing it up, peered out between the bars. There indeed was a woman with disheveled hair, holding her hands over her heart as one distressed with running. She was leaning against a corner of the gateway. When she saw my face at the window, she threw herself forward and shouted in a voice laden with menace, "Monster, give me my child." So Dracula's clearly stolen her kid, but she thinks it's Harker who's done it. So that's so interesting that Dracula becomes him so well that he fools the peasants. The local people cannot tell the difference between Dracula and Harker. The woman who comes to the castle accuses Harker of stealing her child. The truly disturbing notion is not that Dracula impersonates Harker, but that he does it so well. His success at impersonating his intended victims is one of the biggest threats to the novel. And indeed, the story of Dracula is often read as a fear of the reverse colonization narrative, which is this idea of foreign adversaries successfully blending in and destroying the native English population. So as the colonizers would go into a country and impose themselves on it, the reverse colonization, excuse me, is that the people of the colonized countries would come back and destroy England. And that's what very commonly Dracula is read as, this kind of late Victorian fear of the foreign perverting people of England. But really, it's a very simple reading. And I think the enduring appeal of the novel is that it isn't so simple or straightforwardly read. And the reason for that is there are many foreign characters in the novel. It's not just Dracula versus some Englishmen. 2 of the heroes, one is Abraham Van Helsing, who is Dutch, so foreign, and Quincy Morris, who is an American from Texas. And so these are people who are not native English people who help defeat Dracula in the end. But you can see there's this idea of Stoker's to kind of compare the foreign in the novel. So you have here, he describes Dracula's thick eyebrows that met over the nose now seemed like a heaving bar of white hot metal. And it says here, Van Helsing's face grew set as marble and his eyebrows converged so they almost touched over the nose. That's a similar description of these two characters. And the way they talk is very similar too. And again, this could just be Stoker trying to write people who don't speak English natively. And this is how he does it. But it's interesting that he gives them the same method of speaking. Dracula says that Harker will be an extra miles away, probably working at Papers of the Law with my other friend Peter Hawkins. So, and Van Helsing does again use the same way of speaking. Knowledge of the blood given to Miss Lucy would at once frighten and jealous Mr. Holmwood too. There must be none so. So they both talk like that. And of course, Dracula is a very determined character. Van Helsing is a very determined character, and Quincy Morris, who's the American, is also, Seward describes him as Quincy Morris had always been the one to arrange the plan of action, and Arthur and I had been accustomed to obey him implicitly. So this is a strong character who takes charge of the English people. So it's not as if the foreign is a constant threat. And so you can see that Quincy Morris holds great psychological power over the men who submit themselves to control by a foreigner. So this is a willing submission of these people. So the complexity of the novel does not lend itself to a simple interpretation of foreigner bad or English good. Indeed, it's the Texan Quincy Morris who makes the ultimate sacrifice at the end of the book and is the ultimate hero of the novel. He is one of the men who destroys Dracula by stabbing him through the heart with a Bowie knife while Jonathan Harker cuts off his head. It says here at the end, came the sweeping flash of Jonathan's great knife. I shrieked as I saw it shoot through the throat, whilst at the same moment Mr. Morris's Bowie knife plunged into the heart. And if you go to the Alamo now in San Antonio, there's a Bowie knife displayed, and it mentions that a Bowie knife was the one who destroyed Dracula. So don't mess with Texas, I guess, is the moral of the story. So as discussed, a reverse colonization narrative cannot be the only simplistic interpretation of Dracula, nor can the other overrepresented category of analysis for Dracula, which in my view has become just completely overwhelming. And that is reading the novel as a metaphor for sexuality. This has become synonymous with the text since the early 20th century, since Freud, basically. But it's not a reading that would have been prevalent during the novel's publication in 1897, because that's before Freud was famous. And that you'll see later, the reviews of the time, 1897, only allude to the shocking nature of its gore and horror, not mentioning it being particularly sexual. It's only with the rise of Freudian interpretations of phallic stakes and penetration that Dracula has become such a sexually suggestive novel to modern readers. And of course, there's a reason for this. When Freud became the dominant theory over psychology, there was an essay by Ernest Jones called On the Nightmare, which was published in 1912. And this explicitly detailed the sexual interpretation of the vampire figure with the penetration. This was originally in German. However, Jones's interpretation was not available in English until after the First World War. So that's 1918 when we first start getting these ideas of the vampire equals sex, which is obviously well after Dracula's published. The essay was, in fact, not printed in its entirety in English until 1931, so that's much later. But since then, vampire stories, and Dracula in particular, have been read as a metaphor for comprehensive transgressive sexuality. Basically, any non-normative sexuality is read into Dracula. And the very common interpretation is that Dracula is this foreign menace who over-sexualizes the pure English women. And again, that's a very simplistic reading. I think that reading proves to be limiting in terms of analysis, since assigning the vampire as a single metaphor, in this case sexuality, frequently ignores other equally valid and much more complex interpretations. Indeed, to me, it seems bizarre to interpret a historical monster through a Freudian lens, considering Freud did not become prominent until the early 20th century. And as we've seen, the vampire has been around much longer than that. So that wouldn't be something that was associated with during the time when it was big. And so I'm interested in finding out what people thought of the vampire when these stories were written. And the dangers of seeing Dracula in particular only through a Freudian lens are to assign our often mistaken biases of Victorian sexuality to it. And people do that all the time. It's the repressed Victorians and the fear of sex and all this. And that's wrong on many levels. And also it misses how actually progressive the novel was in its time, particularly regarding its female characters. There's a very simplistic interpretation where they claim that Lucy, who's the woman who gets turned into a vampire, is sort of phallically penetrated to make her, a good woman again. And again, that's very simplistic because I don't think it takes into account the complexity of her character or indeed the character of the other woman of the novel, which is Mina. And she's modern. She's a very feminist character, I think, as we'll see. And that was because, again, looking at the contemporary ideas, she was modeled on this idea of the new woman. And that was very popular during the end of the 19th century. The concept of the new woman was one that preoccupied society. The new woman was defined in an 1894 article as one who's equal to a man, though retain traditional duties of wife and home. So it's not quite feminist, but getting there. In 1896, the year before Dracula was published, American writer Emma Wolfe dismissed the term in her book, The Joy of Life, and that's right here. She says, "I hate that phrase, new woman. Of all the tawdry, run-to-heel phrases, that strikes me the most disagreeably. When you mean by the term the woman who believe in and ask for the right to advance in education, the arts, and professions with their fellow men, you are speaking of a phase in civilization which has come gradually and naturally and is here to stay. There is nothing new or abnormal in such a woman. But when you confound her with the extremists who wantonly disown the obligations and offices with which nature has honored them, you do the earnest progressive woman great wrong." And that you can see here, this is trying to correct this term, because at that time it was just a word for any kind of radical woman would be a new woman. She wants to wear trousers, she's a new woman. And so you can see that Wolfe is careful to differentiate between earnest progressive women and radicals, those who would wantonly disown the obligation and offices with which nature has honored them. In other words, disregard the duties of a wife and mother. According to Wolfe, the new woman was a natural state of societal progression. Its proponents still wished to retain the duties of motherhood, which were customary for women during that time period. But there's a disconnect in her mind between people using the term to describe radical women demanding complete freedom and independence from all duties and the reality of the new woman movement. By this point, as I've said, the term had become synonymous for any independent, radical thinking woman, as evidenced by Stoker's use of it in the text. Wilhelmina, or Mina Murray, later Harker, possesses an independent spirit and an ability to act without the assistance of men. When her husband is ill, she takes charge of the hunt for Dracula. She is also a loving wife and future mother, in deference to the obligations and offices with which nature had honored her. She possesses, according to Van Helsing, both, quote, a man's brain and a woman's heart, embodying aspects of both sexes. And she actually applauds the idea of a new woman here. She says some of the new woman writers will someday start an idea that men and women should be allowed to see each other asleep before proposing or accepting. But I suppose the new woman won't condescend in future to accept. She will do the proposing herself, and a nice job she will make of it too. There's some consolation in that. So again, Mina's not a pathetic character at all. She's actually quite a modern character if she's done correctly. Really interesting character. As discussed in the previous chapters about sensation novel, it was commonly believed that women had a more delicate nervous system, more easily acted upon by all impressions, and more liable to all diseases of excitement, according to Thomas Laycock in 1816. This is similar to the alleged susceptibility of women to sensation novels, as discussed in the previous lecture. By this logic, the hypersensitive hysterical woman is also more prone to lunacy than men are. And that's one of the things that they claimed. If you read too much horror, women would be driven insane. According to Cesare Lambrosio and William Ferrero in 1895, quote, female lunatics in general surpass their male prototypes in all sexual aberrations and tendencies. 2/3 of female lunatics suffer from maladies of the reproductive organs, which bring on convulsions and produce abnormal sensations, which are transformed into illusions, hallucinations, delirium, or obscene impulses. And you remember back in the sensation thing that they thought that it could lead to madness and women wouldn't be able to do their function of childbearing, the atrophy of the reproductive organs. And that's repeated here. In Dracula, the only vampires aside from the title character are female vampires, and Dracula is not described with the same voluptuous wantonness as the female vampires are, hinting that unrestrained wanton sexuality is typical in the female, so you can see Stoker's read that. This echoes the belief proposed by Lambrosio and Ferrero that women are intrinsically more sexual creatures when not restrained by the conventions of society and sanity. But the novel Dracula actually features only one lunatic character, and that is a male. Max Nordau's influential text Generation, published in 1895, 2 years before Dracula, focused on the concept of degeneration in art and literature, declaring degenerates are not always criminals, prostitutes, anarchists, and pronounced lunatics. They are often authors and artists. And we saw that again back in the Penny Dreadful sensation idea, that these people there's something wrong with people who would like that kind or read or create that kind of literature. And it says here, books and works of art exercise a powerful suggestion to the masses. If they are absurd and antisocial, they exert a disturbing and corrupting influence on the views of a whole generation. So again, he's repeating that Penny Dreadful idea that if these poor, simple people read this literature, then, you know, the whole generation could be destroyed. It's back to the violent video game argument there. But if you think about generation in this form, this poses an interesting context for thinking about the characters in Dracula, particularly the lunatic R.M. Renfield. Renfield is introduced by Dr. Seward as his zoophagous patient, he calls him. And he consumes spiders, flies, and even a bird at one point in order to ingest their life to prolong his own. Dracula does this too, of course, but Renfield's focus is not blood, but rather souls. He wants to collect souls. The cause of Renfield's madness is never established. He's not a vampire, nor are there any indications that Dracula has attacked him. Yet he appears to share some sort of telepathic connection to Dracula, as his victims in the story do. There is no mentioned cause of Renfield's madness. And if we read this from a Freudian perspective, the approach for psychiatry is classically retrospective, aimed at uncovering causes. But in Dracula, which is pre-Freud, there is no mention of a history to the disorder, no attempt to detect causes. The trajectory is rather forward, and the object of understanding not so much the patient, but a situation and the means of bringing the situation under control. And that's what Seward, as a psychiatrist, says in the novel. There's never any, I wonder why he's like this. It's like, well, how do I help him? Which again is sort of the anti-Freudian psychology. Renfield's peculiar system of belief intrigues Dr. Seward, who indulges his delusions and describes him as mentally accomplished. Indeed, Renfield shows an aptitude for mathematical calculation and his desire to consume life. He keeps a little notebook in which he jots down pages of it filled with masses of figures, generally single numbers added up in batches, and then the totals added in batches again. And that's how he keeps track of all the souls he's consumed. There is a method to Renfield's madness, and that method is a scientific one. He also does not blindly serve Dracula. When Dracula arrives at Carfax, Renfield swears to him, "I am here to do your bidding, master. I am your slave, and you will reward me, for I shall be faithful." So he offers his services to Dracula for the promise of a reward, not merely because he's slavishly devoted for him. And he only lets Dracula in after Dracula proves to him that he can summon an army of rats for Renfield to consume. So although mad, his character is not idiotic. He has this rationality to him. He's on the border between being almost supernatural. Before Dracula comes, he seems to see him come on this ship in the sea, and also a mortal character. At the end of his life, Dracula throws him to the ground and paralyzes him. And his nature borders on being an antagonist to the heroes and an ally, alternately condemning Mina to death by letting Dracula in and then trying to save her by sacrificing himself. And he tells them that Dracula's attacking her, and that's how they can save her. Renfield is the redemptive character whose timely confession of his collaboration with Dracula ultimately saves Mina's life. He also appears well-read and aware of contemporary events, congratulating Quincy Morris on Texas's admission into the Union. And he's also familiar with Van Helsing's work on the evolution of the brain. And so since no cause of his madness are ever discussed, it's possible that he may be one of Nordau's examples of a man driven to degeneracy by reading about antisocial topics and developing a perverse religious mania because of that. Renfield possibly falls under the category of men who prefer idleness, luxury, and self-indulgence more than to work, thrift, and self-denial. In other words, the author, the artist, and of course, the aristocrat. And that last one means Dracula. The former warrior in his vampiric state has transformed into a parasite feeding off the blood of others. Contemporary beliefs in the causes of lunacy were linked to degeneracy. Again, this is pre-Freud. They thought that people went crazy because they'd somehow de-evolved into degeneracy, an affliction where the mind was returned to a more primitive animalistic state. Lunatics also displayed physical animalistic attributes and deformities, according to Nordau. These could include, it says here, degeneracy betrays itself among men in certain physical characteristics, imperfection in the development of the external ear, and irregularities in the form and position of the teeth. Nordau is a big phrenologist as well. They believe that like the shape of the head could tell you if you're going to be a criminal or not. And so these physical signs would exist. But these 2 points, the ear, the teeth, are particularly relevant in the character of Dracula, undoubtedly a moral degenerate. When he first meets Dracula, Harker notes of him that the mouth was fixed and rather cruel looking, with peculiarly sharp white teeth. These protruded over the lips. For the rest, his ears were pale and at the top extremely pointed. So again, you can see he has this deformity there. And the description coincides with Nordau's assessment of degenerate, and Van Helsing describes Dracula as a criminal and of criminal type. Nordau and Lombroso would so classify him, and qua criminal, he is of imperfectly formed mind. So Van Helsing obviously subscribes to Nordau's theories that a deformed body equates to a deformed mind. And the exemplar of degeneration in the novel is Dracula, the supernatural criminal. He talks about he has a criminal lunatic mind, but also the ability to control minds as well as to enslave both men and women. So upon its initial publication in 1897, reviews of the novel broadly commented on its eagerness to take horror to its extreme conclusion. And this is the review in the Athenaeum. The vampire idea is very ancient indeed, and there are in nature no doubt mysterious powers to account for the vague belief in such beings. Mr. Stoker's way of presenting this matter, and still more the matter itself, are of too direct and uncompromising a kind. They lack the essential note of awful remoteness, and at the same time subtle affinity that separates while it links our humanity with unknown beings and possibilities hovering on the confines of the known world. Dracula is highly sensational, there's that word again, but it is wanting in the constructive art as well as in the higher literary sense. And the review in The Spectator a month later agrees with this assessment, addressing his same problems with the text. Mr. Bram Stoker gives us the impression of having deliberately laid himself out in Dracula to eclipse all previous efforts in the domain of the horrible, to go one better than Sheridan Le Fanu and all the other professors of the flesh-creeping school. Mr. Stoker has shown considerable ability in the use that he has made of all the available traditions of vampirology, but we think his story would have been all the more effective if he had chosen an earlier period. The up-to-dateness of the book, the phonographic diaries, typewriters, and so on, hardly fits in with the medieval methods which ultimately secure the victory for Count Dracula's foes. So you can see in that one, the flesh-creeping label seems to represent a form of critical dismissal similar to that implied by the sensation tag. Indeed, the reviewer's association of Stoker with Le Fanu confines him to the sensation genre. Since as discussed in the previous lecture, both of those authors were defined in such a way. Even in 1897, any story featuring fantastical elements seems to have been read by reviewers as a tale to satisfy the inherently insatiable appetites of the masses for the horrific and not worthy of literary study. It says here he just wants to go one better than these other flesh creepers. Both of these reviews criticize Stoker for being too modern and putting it into modern day London, but it is this variability of linking the past with the more modern present that I think is the novel's greatest strength. That it does have elements, foots in both these camps, and this kind of ancient mystical past and this modern technological present. I think it strikes this perfect balance where neither of those aspects overwhelm the other. Besides, it's a very common saying to write what you know, and Bram Stoker certainly knew Victorian London and all its modern trappings. Bram Stoker was a man from elsewhere, from Dublin in Ireland, a man who lived most of his life in London, working for Sir Henry Irving, the most famous actor of the late Victorian age. As a child, he was sickly and confined to his bed, where his Irish mother would tell him stories of his native land, both fantastical and real, including her brush with the cholera epidemic of Sligo in the 1840s, which undoubtedly inspired his imagination for horror. He married Florence Balcombe in 1878, whose former suitor had been Oscar Wilde, so lucky break for her there. Along with Wilde, whom he kept friendly with even after his exile to France, Stoker also rubbed elbows with the other literary greats of late Victorian London, including Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, author of Sherlock Holmes, to whom he was distantly related. Bram Stoker is interesting because he was particularly preoccupied with the question of censorship. In 1908, he wrote an essay defending censorship in fiction for the greater good. It says here, there is in reality, whose existence and progress must be based on cosmic laws, no such thing as absolute freedom. The needs and necessarily recognized rights of individuals and groups must at times become so conflicting that some sort of give and take rules or laws are necessary to the general good. And you can see here that he talks about this in the context of writing, that he recognizes the potential in writing for the knowledge of evil, similar to what the critics of sensation stories, and indeed Nordau, wrote about these horrific stories. True to the spirit of the protagonist of his novel, he advocates battling the evil. Says it is natural for man to sin as to live and to take a part in the necessary strife of living. But if progress be a good and is to be aimed at in the organization of national forces, the powers of evil, natural as well as arbitrary, must be combated all along the line. It is not sufficient to make a stand, however great here and there. The whole frontier must be protected. So he sees censorship as this kind of barrier to letting evil run wild. And you can see parallels, obviously, in his novel. The defeat of Dracula must not end in his retreat from England, which he does initially run away, but they follow him, but in his final dissolution. Otherwise, the plague of vampirism continues to spread. Similarly, in Stoker's view, books must be censored so that the evil ideas contained in them do not go on to infect others. He echoes the censors of the Penny Dreadfuls mentioned in the previous lecture. Although Stoker's support of censorship may seem curious considering the violent and erotic themes in Dracula, it is important to note that at the end of the novel, the corruption is purified. The scar disappears from Mina's forehead, a physical indication of the presence of the pollution passing from her. Here, in Stoker's ideal world, is the victory of good over the wantonness of evil in both life and literature. He writes of dark matters only to more strongly illuminate the light of the human spirit and its ultimate triumph over the forces of darkness. And to me, that's the main message of the novel, is this goodness of the human spirit overcoming the greatest of all evils. And the choice of narrators in the novel is telling in this regard. The title character, Dracula, never speaks except through the words of others. People record him or write him down or paraphrase him, but he never has like a diary entry. Most of the other characters in the novel are given their own voice, but Dracula remains silent. A plausible theory that the absence of Dracula as narrator is Stoker's defense of moral art in this thing here. By making his narrators upstanding and decent people, he is endorsing the idea that art itself is the means of reestablishing the line between good and evil. Stoker gives narrative voice and therefore control of the story to his heroes, and their writing down is the means by which the different characters preserve themselves against Dracula's vampiric powers of dissolution. The act of writing is as effective a charm against vampirism as the crucifix. And there's a bit where they talk about, if I just keep writing about this, somehow I'll figure out the solution to it. That's what Harker says. Writing is thus the hero of the work. The compilation of the text is central to the battle against Dracula, as the community defeats him by piecing it and their individual bits of knowledge together. It is the power and knowledge contained in the written word that brings about Dracula's downfall as effectively as the knife in his heart. I don't think I like that bit. I might cross this out. Anyway, I'll make a note. So most people know Dracula, not from Stoker's novel, but likely because of a movie. Dracula, along with Sherlock Holmes, is one of the most filmed literary characters in history. The novel was almost immediately adapted into a stage play, and then with the advent of cinema in the 1920s, plagiarized by German director F.W. Murnau in the form of the 1922 silent film Nosferatu, eine Symphonie des Grauens. This was an adaptation of the novel that attempted to circumvent copyright law, but Bram Stoker's widow sued Murnau for copyright infringement, and all copies of the movie were supposed to be destroyed, but they weren't. Now, the film attempted unsuccessfully to avoid copyright issues by distancing itself from Stoker's text, renaming the vampire Count Orlok and making his death nothing like the race against time in the novel. Rather, the destruction of Orlok is brought about by the heroine. After reading a passage in the Book of Vampires that states, quote, only a woman can break the vampire's frightful spell, a woman pure in heart who will offer her blood freely to Nosferatu and will keep the vampire by her side until after the cock has crowed. So you can see, again, you have this kind of like Varney. He has to find a woman to love him, to be willing to sacrifice herself to him. But the sexual implications of the passage are obvious. It's not enough that the vampire's bloodlust must be sated, but also his carnal lust. She has to keep him occupied all night somehow. And 1922, of course, is when the Freudian readings start to emerge. Nosferatu's effect on future vampire cinema and the public perception of vampires cannot be overstated. The film's ending is the first instance of a vampire being destroyed by sunlight, which will become a common feature in later vampire fiction. Before this, like in Dracula, he's wandering about in the daylight, no problem. It's not an issue. It was never an issue in the folklore. It's just this movie. They thought that'd be quite a cinematic death, and indeed it is. So fair enough. Nosferatu is really an eerie film and an uncomfortable watch in its historical context of 1920s Germany. Orlok's appearance is a recognizable caricature of the Jew. You can see that here, large hook nose, claw-like fingers, and bushy eyebrows. And he is a plague bearer who preys upon virtuous Aryan women. He brings the rats and disease in the movie. Adolf Hitler described the Jewish people as Blutsauger, which is bloodsuckers, in Mein Kampf in 1925, 3 years after Nosferatu was released. These are very popular ideas at the time. And as I've mentioned, the uncomfortable associations of the vampire with the foreign other have always been there, but they're made very explicit in Nosferatu, and that's why it's difficult to watch when you know how that ends. Now, the movies provided what might be termed a vampire stereotype in popular culture, and this stereotype is Bela Lugosi's Dracula from 1931. This is based on the stage play version, so there aren't really any special effects or action scenes, and the movie really relies solely on Lugosi's magnetic performance and that of an impressive supporting cast. The sexuality aspect of the vampire is toned down for this version because it's 1931. While Dracula still menaces beautiful women, it all happens off the screen. This scene here where he bites her, that's not in the movie. That's a publicity photo, but wasn't in the actual film because it's too risque. His Dracula enters a sleeping woman's bedchamber and stands menacingly over her. The camera focuses on his steadily blurring eyes as he bends down to bite, but you never see that. But ironically, the off-camera act of vampirism makes it even more suggestive, since the audience can imagine if the vampire bite is just that or something more. So that's the benefit of censorship, is that you can often make the audience think something more than you could actually show. In post-war cinema in Britain, the depiction of vampirism was still censored, but it was replaced with an even more sexually suggestive scene. In 1958, Christopher Lee's Dracula is given limited screen time compared to earlier versions, but he projects, as film historian Jonathan Rigby describes, quote, a mixture of erotic magnetism and animalistic ferocity, and you can see these two things here, which, though vividly present in Bram Stoker's novel, had never before been captured on screen. The erotic magnetism is apparent in a scene in which Dracula enters his conscious victim's bedroom. She lets him in, nuzzles her face and neck, and then presses her down the bed as the scene cuts. The censors actually wanted to have him enter her bedroom and the door shut, and that would be the cut of the scene. But the producer of the movie knew someone on the British censorship board and said, can we just have a little more before we cut? And so he said yes, but it was very suggestive at the time. In another instance in the movie, the conscious victim is lying on the bed waiting for Dracula, and she actually takes her crucifix off so that he can come near her. And he bends over the bed and lifts his cape up before the scene ends. So the difference here is that the two women in the movie are aware of Dracula's violation, and they choose not to resist it. They, in fact, want it. This suggests that the vampiric assault is desirable, and this theme of the willing victim appears in the majority of later cinematic interpretations to this very day. Christopher Lee's Dracula is also one of the few interpretations which understands the aspect of Stoker's novel that the Count's purpose is to blend in with the society he is invading, and thus he speaks with an English accent and appears a normal, well-mannered individual until his wrath is roused, and then the animalistic ferocity is seen in all its glory, in glorious Technicolor, which Hammer Studios used to great effect. And this is my personal favorite version. I think Christopher Lee nails the character. I think he's perfect. I think he is both romantic and horribly threatening. Well, you either get one or the other now. This is the version I highly recommend that everyone watch. Now, in more recent years, the vampire's retained its erotic appeal, but taken on the aspect of a sensitive romantic lover rather than an aggressive seducer. Gary Oldman's Dracula and Bram Stoker's Dracula, I always do that because it's not Bram Stoker's Dracula, is cursed with vampirism after his wife dies, and his attraction to Mina arises from her resemblance to his dead wife. The film, directed by Francis Ford Coppola, deviates from the novel by turning Dracula into a tragic romantic figure, doomed to live a meaningless life through the centuries until he can be reunited with his true love. And the tagline on the film poster is actually "Love Never Dies." So it's not really anything to do with Bram Stoker's Dracula, but people seem to like it for some reason. Now, Bela Lugosi's distinctive accent appears in parodies of the figure, such as the Count in Sesame Street. Dracula is therefore a familiar character from childhood, even though a child might not be familiar with the source material, or at least one would hope. As with Count Chocula there, the joke of the Count only works if you're familiar with Dracula. Similarly, in the recent Hotel Transylvania films, Dracula insists that he does not use the catchphrase blah, 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 which is repeatedly quoted in the film when his name is mentioned, and is actually a reference to a parody version of Bela Lugosi's Dracula by comedian Lenny Bruce in the 1960s. Mel Brooks's Dracula Dead and Loving It is a full-length feature parody of many Dracula adaptations. Now, parody, of course, relies on the audience's familiarity with what is being mocked, and the fact that all ages recognize Dracula proves how pervasively that particular vampire has infused popular culture. But one side effect of parody, however, is neutralization of threat and its target. And you can see this as we go into the 20th and 21st centuries, that the vampires become this kind of punchline, this joke. There's not really threat anymore. It's either a joke or a, well, we'll see what they are. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, there seems to be a renewed attempt to rehumanize vampires, notably in UNT's own Anne Rice's The Vampire Chronicles and Stephenie Meyer's Twilight series. Rice's first vampire novel, Interview with the Vampire from 1976, involves an interview with the sympathetic vampire. By the end of the story, the interviewer Daniel begs to be made into a vampire by the vampire narrator Louis, who is surprised by his request since he told his story in an attempt to illustrate the agony he suffers as a vampire, rather than to make the vampire life appealing to a mortal. So Rice's narrative acknowledges the ambiguity of the vampire, both a horrible state of existence and yet somehow seductive. But Rice's vampires with moral dilemmas and genuine emotions would be the prototype for Stephenie Meyer's vegetarian vampires in Twilight, who refuse to drink human blood and feel undying and monogamous love for others. Twilight's often read in the context of Stephenie Meyer's Mormon beliefs of abstaining from sex until after marriage, and that's, he won't have anything really to do with her until after they're married. So you can read that as a parable of that. Similarly, Rice's vampires are frequently read as a metaphor for the AIDS crisis during which they were largely published. You have this blood disease thing going on. Buffy the Vampire Slayer there uses the vampire interprets it through a feminist lens. And the appeal to teenage audiences in Buffy, Twilight, and shows like The Vampire Diaries have reinterpreted the character as hot bad boys and goth girls with angsty teenage problems. This is nothing new, as we saw from Barney and indeed Carmilla, as the vampires always personified human anxieties from the time in which they're written. But I argued that the singular focus on sexuality and romanticism has led to the vampire losing some of its bite, if you'll excuse the pun. The over-romanticization, or rather the romance being the sole focus of the vampire tale, is a new development in the 20th century. It is romance to the exclusion of all else, including the recognition of the murderous and monstrous nature of the vampire. As I think I said way before in the first lecture, part of being a vampire is murdering others to survive. So really, you can't love people if that's your attitude. In the modern interpretations, eternal romance is the reward of vampirism. You have this love you for every moment of forever kind of idea, that you would have this wonderful everlasting love through the act of vampirism, and that doesn't compute. If that's true, if eternal romance is the reward of vampirism, therefore becoming a vampire is not a punishment. This is an uneasy interpretation in a figure that literally murders to survive, and it robs the vampire of some of its depths, which can be seen when examining its historical context. The modern vampire is largely a metaphor, a means to an end, not a creature in its own right, with its own history and mythology, as it was in previous versions. The historical and mythological aspects were made explicit in Dracula because Stoker did his research, and I think that explains in part why it's the most enduring vampire tale of all. You have Glynis Byron saying, quite rightly here, our culture has turned a cold, alienating, impersonal monster obsessed with power and possession into the Byronic hero of eternal romance. And we know about Byron, his vampire was actually not a Byronic hero, he was a monster like Dracula. All too often, we have similarly humanized our own creations, our own late 20th century vampires, given them infusions of good blood to save them, or turned their passionless bites into gentle exchanges, forced them to anguish over moral questions, transformed them into glamorous esteets, sensitive, lonely immortals, redemptive, holy babies. Perhaps we have lost the true threat, the true violence of Stoker's king vampire, and I would agree with that 100%. But the vampire is being, and always has been, interpreted and reinterpreted in the society in which it exists. I hope this lecture series has illuminated some of the many forms it has taken over the years and some of the reasons why it may assume those guises in the context in which they were written. Our monsters reflect the ages in which we live, for good or ill, but understanding where the vampire comes from will hopefully add to your enjoyment of your favorite features this Halloween season. Happy Halloween. See you later.